The Warship Island Arc of One Piece is its first major foray into filler. But One Piece is also a series that isn't very well known for its filler. It uses it very sparingly because the story is so very long in the first place. When we take a look at this first major arc of filler, there is a lot that can be said positively about why this filler exists in the first place and what it adds to the overall story of One Piece that may have been less well articulated if it didn't exist in the first place. The story of the Warship Island Arc is about a little girl who seeks to reunite a dragon with its home. The Marines have hold of a little girl named Apis, who is the holder of a devil fruit and someone who has information about the location of what's called dragonite, a special substance that would allow its holder to obtain essentially immortality through a process of alchemy or potion making, which is what One Piece implies would happen if the dragonite were ever to be obtained. Apis is from Warship Island. She escapes the clutches of the Marines and then is picked up and rescued at sea by the Straw Hat Pirates. The Straw Hats bring her back to her home on Warship Island and meet her fellow villagers. Luffy and his crew end up finding out that Apis is secretly feeding and taking care of a giant dragon, which is called the Millennial Dragon, the very dragon that has links to the Dragonite, which can potentially grant immortality. The Straw Hats and Luffy agreed to help Apis bring her dragon back to his homeland, which is what he really wants and what Apis really wants to do for him. Apis is able to understand this old dragon that she calls Ryuji, because she has the Whisper fruit, a devil fruit that allows her to communicate with animals. All while this is taking place, the Marine sends agents and mercenaries after Apis to reclaim her and to find the Dragonite, but they escape safely with the help of the Straw Hat Pirates. The Straw Hats take Apis and the Millennial Dragon to an island, a lost island, not far from Warship Island. And on that particular island, they learn that that island is not the home of the dragon's nest, that they are trying to locate so that Ryuji can return to his home. There they face a Marine mercenary on their way back to Warship Island, but escape his clutches, but are met unfortunately with a blockade that prevents them from successfully retreating from the lost island and returning to Warship Island to bring Ryuji and Apis back safely. The Marines, led by a thoughtful Commodore, attack the Straw Hats and then eventually the Millennial Dragon after he fights back for the safety of Apis. Being very old, Ryuji succumbs to his wounds and doesn't have the strength to continue, but he lets Luffy know that everything will be okay. A horde of dragons begin to fly overhead, surrounding the Navy and the Straw Hats. Luffy uses them to help him defeat the Commodore and the Navy, and just as they're defeated, we see that Ryuji is sinking to the bottom of the sea. Soon an earthquake occurs. Land starts to bubble up from beneath the sea. A giant island surrounding Warship Island resurfaces, and it turns out that this is the very dragon's nest that they were looking for, the one that the Millennial Dragons called home and the one that Ryuji was trying to return to. They find out that the Millennial Dragons are called Millennial Dragons because of the fact that every 1,000 years their nesting site comes up from the bottom of the sea so that they can raise their young and lay their eggs, and it has nothing to do with their actual age. This was a truth and story that was lost to time. Apis says goodbye to Ryuji and she understands the circle of life, and the Straw Hats secure her safety on Warship Island, and everyone leaves happy, having defeated the wicked Navy who were unable to get the Dragonite, and the Straw Hats return to the sea, continuing their journey to the Grand Line after Luffy offers a place on the Straw Hat crew to Apis, who declines, saying that she'd rather stay on her island with her people. The story is a very simple story. There aren't a whole lot of characters. It's enjoyable as a very good representation of what the One Piece anime is and has come to be at this point in the story at the very end of the East Blue arc. As far as its enjoyability, it would probably be a B- or C+. However, I think the issues of this story mostly being related to its pacing and its ability to tie the story into the overall plot of One Piece betrays actually how well executed it is and how thoughtful its storytelling is and how well it creates a platform for what is going to be One Piece, the One Piece saga in the Grand Line. At this point in One Piece, at the end of the East Blue arc, the audience doesn't really understand what One Piece is about. It just seems to be a story about pirates. Luffy is on a quest to become the king of the pirates and he has to get to the Grand Line to do it, but the audience doesn't really understand what's there or why he has to go there to become it. The audience doesn't understand that there are factions in the One Piece saga that have not yet presented themselves, and that there are villains and stakes and complexities in the One Piece saga that have not even been addressed yet. So because of that mystery that the audience still seems to have with One Piece at this point in time, this filler creates a lot of interesting choices that clue the viewers into what they will eventually experience within One Piece. The first thing we learned that is really important to One Piece as a whole in the Warship Island arc is about the way that the crew interacts with itself, amongst itself. Before the Warship Island arc that they found along their trip in order to get to the Grand Line, they had only just become a crew, and prior to then they were only piecing players together. Zoro had been the longest member of the crew. Usopp was a longtime member of the crew. Sanji had just joined the crew, and Nami had just joined the crew officially after the events of the Arlong Park arc. And right after Arlong Park, they made a quick trip to Logtown to make their way eventually to the Grand Line, a very symbolic trip, but necessary trip for the Straw Hat crew. In this arc, we really see them for the first time interacting with each other when they have downtime, and it does a lot to establish who they are as crewmates and friends and their dynamics amongst each other when things aren't constantly in turmoil. And it is really refreshing to see and to understand the very quiet moments in which Nami is just observing everybody interacting with each other. The moments where Sanji is taking care of Nami, when Sanji and Zoro are just interacting with one another without yelling.
And another. Here you go. Okay. Zoro. Right. And this one. Can you hand him over to me without?
It really establishes what their journey is about. It's not about ambition. It's not about taking over the world. Their quest as Straw Hats is about fulfilling their dreams and taking each step that they need to take in order to get to the place where they all want to be and to get what they all want to find together. Symbolically, this arc does a very good job of establishing the mystery and the history that is really baked into the One Piece story. Although this particular story isn't canon to One Piece, it establishes a lot of what's going to be taking place in the Grand Line very early on. In the Grand Line, the journey becomes very quickly a quest to find all of the ancient stones called poneglyphs. These are remnants of the past and are only decipherable by a very select few. In the Warship Island arc, the story mirrors that quest in the way that Luffy and his crew are trying to decipher the meaning behind the Millennial Dragon. The Millennial Dragon's truth is forgotten by modern people. So the Straw Hat crew, along with Apis, have to go to different islands to look at ruins and old paintings and decipher clues in order to understand who this dragon is and how it can return to the place it needs to be and why it's there in the first place. That mystery is baked into essentially every arc of One Piece, starting with the first arc that takes place after the Straw Hats enter the Grand Line, which is the Alabasta arc. Oda does a phenomenal job creating this narrative and filling it with a lot of meaning, even though particularly and essentially this filler is designed to place a gap between how quickly the anime rolls out and how often new manga issues are released. There are also a lot of other very subtle nods in this story that seem to hint or clue the audience into things that are going to come later in the One Piece saga. Be they really important plot points or just characters and prototypes and themes that they're trying to try out so that the audience can gain some familiarity with what's going to come in the future in the story. One of them, for instance, is Apis herself and her devil fruit. Apis's devil fruit is the whisper fruit, which gives her the ability to speak to animals and communicate with them. She's also a very young girl. She seems to in many ways mirror the character of Tama, who is first introduced in the Wano arc of One Piece. Tama has the ability to create little dango out of her cheeks that, when consumed by an animal or animal hybrid, makes them her friends and essentially makes them fall in love with her so that they will do the things that she asks of them. It seems like Apis is a prototype for Tama, as they're both little girls who utilize animals to do their will or just to make friends. And it's only through meeting the Straw Hats that these little girls use their powers for more useful things to the overall narrative, although they do slightly differ. Apis is a little bit more abrupt and assertive than Tama is as a character. Also, this is the first time in the series that dragons are introduced in a meaningful way. Dragons in One Piece are very symbolic. There is Monkey D. Dragon that was introduced in Logtown. Dragons are also primary villains. There's also the idea of the celestial dragons, which are world nobles that have jurisdiction over the entire planet, often enslaving people. And so in this arc, we're first introduced to dragons as a symbolic idea representing some kind of mystery, some type of unknowable thing that needs to be solved or addressed or dealt with by the Straw Hat Pirates. Up until then, dragons had not been introduced in any meaningful way. Although Luffy's father was seen on screen, his name wasn't presented to the audience until many arcs later. It is also interesting about the way that they decided to embody the dragons in this arc. The millennial dragons, Ryuji, are dragons, but seem to be a lot more bird-like than what one would think of a typical dragon to be. The Warship Island dragons are very Ghibli-esque in their depiction, and in fact the storytelling and the way that the world is created and how the scenes play out do in many ways call back to ideas or familiarity that the audience may have with Studio Ghibli itself. Perhaps the reason why the dragons were crafted in a way that are more bird-like than actual dragons, particularly their wings, which seem to be full of feathers rather than scales and skin, and their tail, which is more bird-like as well, is because since dragons are such an important part of the story, they wanted to create a meaningful difference between the dragons that are seen in this arc and the dragons that are going to come later on in the story, so that when they do come in the story later, they seem like a fresh idea. Still, the audience, through the dragons that they do create in the Warship Island arc, do pick up on the significance and the majesty and the mystery of this ancient species that One Piece is trying to present the audience. There is a villain in the Warship Island arc that also plays a little bit as a prototype for things that are going to come later. The villain Eric, which is a mercenary employed by the Commodore to acquire the Dragonite and basically destroy the Straw Hat Pirates. Eric has the power of the sickle fruit, which allows him to make wind slashes in the air to cut up his enemies. This ability seems to be a prototype for what the audience will eventually see within the Navy with the 6 powers. One of the 6 powers, the abilities that the strongest Navy officers have mastered. One of these 6 powers in particular, which is Rankaku, which is also known as the Tempest Kick. The Tempest Kick is called a wind sickle, which is essentially the same thing as Eric's Devil Fruit ability. And although this ability is primarily used with kicks, it has been shown to be able to be utilized with essentially any appendage, like a tail or a neck at high velocities, to utilize this move. So in many ways, Eric's character, his ability to fight, and his connection to the Marines has given him a lot of allusion to the 6 powers, in particular Rankaku, and how these abilities are utilized later on in the story to fight the Straw Hats. Speaking of the military and the adversarial characters located in that body, the Commodore, the leader of the Marines, that were after Apis and the Dragon Knight represents a very interesting interaction that we see later on in the story. The Commodore seems to be some kind of conflation or embodiment of not just the powers of the Marines as military and legal authorities over the world, but also of the celestial dragons. Commodore Nelson Royal is portrayed as a really obese, slothful, greedy, but very cunning and calculating man. In his presentation as a slothful and greedy person, especially as he seeks the Dragonite, with which he could potentially grant himself immortality, seems to be representative of or an embodiment of the celestial dragons that have not been introduced in the story thus far. Usually the celestial dragons are represented as very slovenly people, very entitled, very greedy people who want to essentially enslave the world for their own riches. This is what we come to understand about who Nelson Royal is as a character. Additionally, his last name, Royal, seems to clue the audience into who he represents metaphorically within the One Piece story, either as an aristocratic elite that runs different countries around the world, but also perhaps the celestial dragons themselves, who seem to be driven by primarily their desire to see themselves as rulers over the entire world, not just in their own time and place, but eternally, which is reflected in the Commodore's seeking of the Dragonite. Other smaller things are also part of this story that clue into other character development aspects that are going to be addressed later on in the series. One being Nami's love and protection of children, which is established here as well. Nami seems to, in this story, be very protective of Apis, especially as the Marines seek to take her from her home and imprison her for her connection to dragons.
Stop right there! Lay one fingernail on that kid and I'll make you beg for
This protection of children comes from her own pathology, having not had half of her own childhood because she was under the control of the Arlong pirates for so much of her life prior to then. Additionally, Luffy, our main character, has some interesting symbolic references in this arc as well. Luffy has somehow acquired the ability to communicate with Ryuji, the Millennial Dragon. There is no real explanation for why he's able to do this. We know in the history of Luffy that he has always had some type of animal magnetism. He fought with a lot of animals and creatures on his home island to get stronger. And he's also been a leader of animals as well. For example, the fighting dugongs, which he became the leader of later on in the story. In this story, he has the ability to understand Ryuji almost completely, which may foreshadow his abilities later on in the series as he continues to fight animals to get stronger, one of the things that he did during the 2-year time skip in order to master his haki. In addition to this, he seems to have gained some animal empathy and sensitivity that seems to be related to his haki as well. There's one more moment that seems to be very evocative for Luffy in this arc as well. In his final bout with Eric, he faces the sickle fruit, and without any defenses, he takes a full blast from Eric's attack. And when he takes that attack, the attack is in the shape of an X that goes across his chest. After watching this scene, having seen the majority of One Piece, particularly the next few arcs leading up to the time skip, we know that after the time skip, Luffy has a huge scar in the shape of an X across his chest. This scar was left by Akainu during the Summit War arc. It was a scar that represents his opposition to the world government and the loss of his brother. So to see Luffy get slashed there in this very early arc seems to be a very clear point of foreshadowing of things that are going to take place in arcs later to come in the series. The Warship Island arc, because of all of these metaphorical and symbolic references, not only clue the audience into things that are going to come later on in the series, but establish the Straw Hats as real characters that can be understood and pathologized and really loved by audiences. This shows how brilliant this arc actually is as filler. Often fillers are just fun, usually forgettable ways for showrunners to create space between upcoming manga issues and the ongoing anime. but the One Piece saga seems to be so important that the writers and Oda embedded as much meaning and value into this arc as they possibly could in order to make use of the symbolism and metaphor that the audience is going to rely on later on in the series. By doing this, they amplify the scenes and stories that the audience will see in the One Piece saga going forward. And for those reasons, although within the entire series, the Warship Island arc is not very important, I cannot say that this is an arc that viewers should skip because it is very evocative, it is very emotive, and it's a very nice story. And I think it is these stories that we tell in One Piece. These slower stories, these stories that build a narrative, that craft something memorable, that aren't always canon, that aren't always part of the main plot, that really builds the love and respect that we have for the One Piece universe. So although it isn't accurate to say that the Warship Island arc is the most influential, the greatest story that anyone's ever told within One Piece, it does still remain, because of how rich it is in symbolism and metaphor for the story that is going to come, a must-see.